Nadia Osei did not go to the market wedding to fall in love. She went because her cousin Agnes had called her 3 separate times in the week before the celebration to make sure she was coming, and Nadia had never, not once in their 26 years of shared family life, been able to say no to Agnes about anything that genuinely mattered to her. When they were 7 years old, Agnes had stood in front of their grandmother and taken the full blame for a window Nadia had broken with a poorly aimed rubber ball, and Nadia had felt the weight of that debt ever since. Agnes never called it in. She simply called 3 times in a week, and that was enough. But she also went to escape a house that had become too small for the argument living inside it. The argument between Nadia and her mother had no single birthday. It had not started on any particular morning over any particular thing. It had grown gradually, the way pressure grows in a sealed container, without announcement, without drama, until the moment it became undeniable. By the time Nadia was 26, it had been building for at least 3 years, and it had turned the house into a place where every ordinary conversation required navigation, where the question of what to eat for dinner could arrive charged with meaning, where silence was not rest but positioning. Her mother, Comfort Osei, was a woman who had constructed her life along lines of absolute certainty and found those lines to be load-bearing. She was intelligent in the specific way that produces results. She saw clearly, planned carefully, executed without sentimentality, and was almost never wrong about practical things. She had raised Nadia alone after Nadia's father died, which had required an enormous private act of will that she had never named as such and never expected anyone to acknowledge. She had kept the house, kept the income, kept Nadia in good schools and better expectations. She had done this all because it needed to be done, and she was the person who could do it, and the cost of doing it had been paid internally and had not been discussed. Nadia understood this. She had understood it for years. What she could not do was live inside the understanding and also live inside her own life at the same time, because her mother's love, vast and genuine and completely sincere, expressed itself as management, as oversight, as the constant low-level correction of a person who has decided that they know better and who, if they are honest, are often right about the facts and entirely wrong about what that gives them the right to do. The most recent and most concrete version of this argument was about a man named Mr. Boateng. He was 51 years old, which was a number Nadia heard and then set aside because the number was not really the problem. He owned property in 2 cities, which was a fact Comfort reported with the quiet satisfaction of a person who considers net worth a meaningful measure of character. He had been suggested by a woman named Gloria, who had been a friend of the family for as long as Nadia could remember, and who had a talent for producing matrimonial suggestions at family gatherings the way other people produce business cards. Comfort had taken the suggestion seriously, had arranged a dinner, and had presented Nadia with the evening as an opportunity, rather than an obligation. Nadia had gone. She had sat across a table from Mr. Boateng and watched him speak and eat and present himself, and she had felt, across 2 hours of polite conversation, the steady low sensation of wrongness that she associated with shoes that fit in the shop and were wrong on the foot. Technically fine, technically adequate, wrong. She had told her mother this, gently the first time, directly the second. The third time had not been gentle or direct. It had been the kind of conversation that ends not with resolution, but with a door closing quietly, in a way that is worse than slamming. That night, Nadia had sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her jaw tight, and a feeling in her chest that she recognized as the feeling of being loved in a way that is never asked whether love is what you need. She went to bed angry, and woke up still angry, and put on the dress she had been planning to wear to Agnes's wedding, and went out into the morning with the argument still inside her, heavy and familiar, wearing it the way you wear bad weather. The wedding was held in a large yard in the Nungua neighborhood, down a side street where the walls of houses were painted in colors that had faded to a comfortable patina, blues and yellows that had given up their brightness without losing their warmth. The yard had been strung with printed fabric between poles, and the folding chairs had been arranged in rows that were already beginning to drift by the time Nadia arrived, pulled gently out of alignment by the particular gravity of a crowd that is comfortable and not performing formality. There was food at a long table along one wall, every dish Nadia associated with celebration, jollof rice with the bottom layer catching perfectly, fried plantain, fish prepared 3 different ways, small bowls of tomato stew with enough pepper to announce itself. There was a sound system playing high life at the volume of a sound system at a celebration, which is to say, too loud in the best possible way. Children ran through the crowd with the complete authority of children who know that celebrations exist partly for their entertainment. An elderly uncle sat in a corner chair and received a steady rotation of respectful visitors without rising. Agnes moved through the yard in her wedding dress, radiant in the uncomplicated and specific way of people who are doing exactly what they want to be doing, her hand finding Fred's hand regularly, touching it and releasing it and finding it again, the way you check for something you know is there but still need to verify. Nadia greeted everyone she recognized and several people she did not, which was the nature of family celebrations. She accepted food and ate it standing up, because the chairs had filled quickly. She talked to 2 aunts and 1 cousin and a childhood friend of Agnes's whom she had met at 4 previous family gatherings and whose name she always forgot by the 5th. She was pleasant and present, and she carried her argument around the yard with her, invisible, hers. After about 40 minutes, she found herself standing at the eastern edge of the yard, near the back fence where some of the chairs had migrated, and the crowd was thinner, and she stood there for a moment just breathing, and that was when she saw him. He was sitting in one of the chairs near the fence. He was sitting the way some people sit in crowds, not defensively, not with any performance of aloneness, but with a kind of self-containment that is comfortable rather than closed, as if solitude is a country he knows well, and is at ease visiting even in the middle of other people's gatherings. He was dressed simply. His shirt had been washed many times, and kept its shape through habit and the particular stubbornness of well-made fabric. His trousers were clean and fit him correctly. His shoes were the kind of shoes that had once been good, and were now merely functional, worn down to a settled adequacy. None of this made an impression as poverty or as statement. He simply looked like himself, like a person who had not spent any part of the morning considering how he would appear. He was watching the wedding, not watching in the casual, distracted way that most people watch events they attend out of obligation, with half the attention leaking toward a phone or a private thought. He was watching with the quality of full attention that is increasingly rare and increasingly striking in its rarity. He watched Agnes and Fred with the expression of a person who has seen enough to know the difference between a real thing and a performance of a real thing, and who has just confirmed which one this is. Nadia walked toward him. She told herself afterward, when she replayed the moment in the way you replay moments that turn out to matter, that she walked toward him simply because it was the least crowded part of the yard, and she needed somewhere to stand. She held this explanation for several weeks. Eventually she let it go. The empty chair beside him was empty for a reason she did not question. She sat down in it. He did not look startled. He looked sideways at her with a brief, unhurried attention, the way a person looks at something that has arrived exactly where it was likely to arrive, and then he looked back at the celebration. She said, "You look like you actually wanted to be here," he said without turning his head. "I did." She said, "Most people at weddings look like they are waiting for the part they enjoy." He turned then and looked at her properly. His eyes were dark and clear, and he looked at her in the direct way that is not rude but does not apologize for itself either. He said, "What part do you enjoy?" She thought about it. She said, "The part where you can tell if it is real." He said, "Can you tell with this one?" She looked at Agnes across the yard, her whole body angled toward Fred with the ease of someone who has already stopped needing to think about where she should be standing. She said, "Yes, very clearly." He said, "I thought so too, or I would not have come." His name was Kwaku. He said it simply, offered it the way people offer a hand, as an introduction and not an advertisement. She gave him hers and he received it the same way, without performing what the name meant to him or whether it meant anything at all. She asked his surname. He smiled very slightly, a private expression rather than a social one, and said it did not add much. She waited a moment to see if he would fill the space. He did not. She let it go, which surprised her, because she was usually precise about details and the absence of a last name was a detail. But something about the simplicity of his refusal made her want to meet it with equal simplicity. They talked. They talked about the wedding first, and then about the neighborhood, and then about her work, which she described for him in terms of what she actually did, rather than what the title on her office door said, and he listened with the kind of attention that asks real questions rather than polite ones. He wanted to understand the actual mechanics of the work, the daily realities of it, what it felt like to do it well, and what it felt like on the days it did not go well. And this was unusual enough that she talked more openly than she had planned to. She asked about his work. He said he was between things. She waited for the familiar performance of temporary inadequacy that men usually produce at this moment, the pivot to what had come before, or what was coming next, the reassurance that this was not permanent and therefore not who he was. It did not come. He said he was between things with the ease of someone who had thought carefully about what that meant to him and had arrived at a position of peace with it. There was no shame in the admission, and no bid for sympathy. He was simply honest about the facts. She found this extraordinary. She did not say so. He had an observational intelligence that came out sideways, in small reframings of things they could both see. He described the wedding, its details and characters, with a precision that was not unkind but was very accurate, and twice he made her laugh with an observation that landed in the particular place that good observations land, not in the place of the joke but in the place of the recognition. By the time Agnes and Fred cut their cake in the center of the yard to a roar of approval from everyone gathered, Nadia had been sitting with this man for 2 hours, and had felt, for those 2 hours, like a person who had set down a weight without noticing the moment of setting it down. She did not ask for his number. He did not offer it. They said their goodbyes with the comfortable ease of two people who have no expectation of seeing each other again and no particular regret about this, and she walked home through the warm evening with the celebration fading behind her. She thought about him on the walk home and told herself it was the novelty. She thought about him the next morning and told herself it was because the conversation had been unusually good. She thought about him for the following week at intervals she chose not to count, and told herself nothing useful. On the Saturday she was at the market near her neighborhood, at the tomato stall she had used for 3 years, and he was there, buying tomatoes from the same vendor, negotiating with the relaxed ease of someone who knows exactly what the price should be. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them pretended not to have seen the other, which she noticed as a quality in him, a general absence of performed indifference. She said, "Do you live near here?" He said, "Not far." They moved to the next stall together without deciding to, then the next. At some point, when her larger bag had become heavy enough to be visible, he took it from her and carried it, and she let him, and neither of them made a moment of it. They talked about the market, about the price of peppers relative to last month, about a vendor halfway down who was selling a variety of herbs she had been looking for. They talked about nothing significant, and about several things that were significant without having been labeled as such, the way conversations sometimes work when both people have decided, without a word about it, to be honest. He walked with her to the main road and then back toward the neighborhood, and she found she did not want the walk to end, which she noted in the same way she was noting most things about this, carefully and without conclusion. 3 more Saturdays. One afternoon near the waterfront when she had gone to sit and think, and he had arrived for reasons he described as unclear and she had not questioned. One meal at a restaurant near the lorry station where the plastic chairs were slightly uneven and the food was excellent, and the conversation went until the waitstaff began to do the gentle choreography of closing around them. He listened to her talk about her mother, once briefly, once at length on an evening when the story came out not because she had planned to tell it but because it arrived and he was there, and he had the quality of a person who can receive a complicated thing without needing to resolve it or verdict it. He did not tell her that her mother was wrong or that she was right, or that she should do any particular thing. He held the whole complicated picture of it without flattening it, and that was the most useful thing anyone had done with that story in years. She noticed his hands. She noticed them early and kept returning to the noticing. They were the hands of a man whose physical life had not required much of them. No roughness, no calluses. The particular cared-for quality that is not simply hygiene but maintenance. The unconscious upkeep of a person who has always had the means and the habit of it. She set this observation next to the other observations she was quietly collecting. The way he moved in certain spaces. A quality of ease that was not performed confidence but absorbed comfort. The way he sometimes caught himself before a word and chose a simpler one. The way he watched certain things in the street, properties and construction and urban infrastructure, with an interest that had something professional in its texture. She filed these things and did not open the file. Then her mother called on a Tuesday evening. Mr. Boateng, Comfort reported, had indicated through the family friend that he was ready to proceed to a formal engagement period. He had thought it over. He felt that a dinner could be arranged within the fortnight. Nadia sat on the edge of her bed and held the phone and said very little. Her mother arranged logistics around the silence. Dates, a restaurant suggestion, what Nadia might consider wearing. The logistics arrived with the authority of things already decided, as if what Nadia needed at this point was not a decision but a schedule. When the call ended, she sat for a long time. She thought about the dinner. She thought about Mr. Boateng's hands, which she remembered with clarity, and which were the hands of a man who looked at her the way he probably looked at the property he owned, as something to be assessed and secured. She thought about Agnes, who was right now somewhere in a house with a kind man who had met her at a bus stop and had looked at her the way a person looks at something they did not know they needed until it arrived. She thought about Kweku, about the conversation at the back fence of the wedding yard, about 2 hours in which she had felt like a full person rather than an arrangement in progress. She called him. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I have to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer honestly." He said, "All right." She said, "Do you think I am someone worth choosing?" Not for the usual reasons, not my family, not my job, not what I represent or what I come from. Just me, as I actually am, on my own. The pause was not hesitation. It was the pause of a person who takes the exact weight of words seriously and will not spend them carelessly. He said, yes, without question and without reservation. She met him at the registry office the next morning. She had told nobody. She wore a blue dress she had bought 2 years before and had never found the right occasion for, a dress she had always kept because putting it on felt like being herself rather than like being dressed for something. Kwaku wore the best shirt she had ever seen on him, plain but pressed, and she could see that he had made a genuine effort, which was its own kind of statement about what the morning meant to him. 2 strangers in the waiting area agreed to be their witnesses. The official asked the questions. They gave the answers. The paperwork took less time than she expected. Outside, in the morning heat of an ordinary street, she was married. She stood beside her husband and felt the full, clean weight of a decision made with her own hands, for her own reasons, with no arrangement in it anywhere. She sent her mother a text message. It said, "I got married this morning. I am well. Please wait until tomorrow before you call." She turned her phone off and stood in the sunlight for a moment, before the day had to become the rest of the day. Living with Kwaku was an education in the difference between what Nadia thought she needed and what she actually needed, and the discovery that these were not always the same list. She had grown up in comfort. Not extravagance, her family was not wealthy in the way that the word wealthy announces itself, but she had grown up in the comfort that means never having to calculate before agreeing to go somewhere, never putting things back at a stall because the week's numbers did not accommodate them, never choosing the route that costs less rather than the route that is better. She had absorbed this comfort the way children absorb the temperatures of their houses, as background condition, indistinguishable from the air. The room in Nungua recalibrated everything. It was rented from a woman named Mrs. Corte, who was perhaps 70, small, and certain in her movements, with hands that knew the specific work of a long-tended garden. Mrs. Corte occupied the main house and let the compound room to tenants with a practical warmth that was not sentimental but was genuine. She left mangoes outside the door when she had extras from the tree in the back of the compound. She never announced this. The mangoes simply appeared, and the first time Nadia saw them she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them before she understood that they were a gift. The room had what it needed and nothing more. A mattress that was better than it looked, a fan that rattled at high speed and could be tolerated on medium, a wardrobe that did not close properly and never would, a small table with 2 chairs, one of which had a leg slightly shorter than the others, which rocked gently, and had to be placed on a particular piece of floor to be stable. The gas burner she had brought from her previous apartment, and which she kept on principle, because it was hers, and she had decided not to leave everything behind when she left. She worked the same hours as before, arriving at the women's organization early and leaving late on the days when the work required it, and on the days when it did not require it, but she had made it require it, which was a habit she was aware of, and did not entirely examine. The organization was a good place. The work was real work, the kind of work that has visible results in people's actual lives, which was what she had chosen it for, and which continued to justify the choice even on the days it was difficult. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. This was one of the areas of her life where her own assessment and her mother's assessment agreed. She paid most of the rent, she bought most of the food, she planned the week's spending with a care she had not practiced before, and she found, which surprised her, that she did not resent it. She had expected resentment. She had expected the calculation to feel like constraint. Instead, it felt like clarity, like being in direct contact with the actual texture of things rather than insulated from it. She was tired. But the tiredness was different from the tiredness of fighting. It was the tiredness of use, of effort spent on something real. Kwaku was present in the way she had learned to want. When he was there fully. He listened to her days with his real attention, not the nodding attention of someone performing listening, but the still attention of a person who is absorbing what is said. He cooked on the evenings when he arrived home before her, nothing complicated but always good, always tasting of care rather than convenience. He noticed when she was tired without her having to announce it, which was a thing she had not known she wanted until she had it. He made her laugh at moments when she had not been expecting to laugh, but he was also absent, not always, and not without return, but regularly and without explanation. 1 day here, 2 days there, occasionally 3, once nearly a week, and he came back each time with the same quietness he always carried, offered nothing of where he had been, and the subject moved past without being opened. She told herself she had chosen a man who valued his privacy. She told herself that demanding a narration of every hour was exactly the kind of oversight she had been trying to escape. She told herself he always came back, and that was the truth, and it was enough. But the file she had been keeping, quietly and without purpose, kept gaining entries. The hands, still. She could not set the hands aside. Her father had had hands like those, and her father had been a man who worked in comfortable offices, and attended meetings in air-conditioned buildings, and had never in his adult life done anything with his hands that required them to be marked by effort. The way he spoke, she had noticed, from the beginning, that he occasionally caught himself before a word, and replaced it with a simpler one, the substitution fast enough to miss if you were not watching. But she was watching. She was always watching things carefully. It was one of the things the women's organization work had taught her, or perhaps had simply given permission to, the professional right to pay careful attention to people, and to trust what that attention found. An incident at the market, a man across the street who started toward them with the directness of recognition and stopped, 2 meters short, changed direction entirely. Kweku had guided her gently to the left before she fully registered the sequence. She said, "Who was that?" He said, "No one I need to see today." She let it go. She had become practiced at letting things go. The practice had its own weight, and the weight accumulated, and she felt it behind her chest, steady and growing. All the observations she had chosen not to follow to their conclusions. Diane, who had been her closest colleague and most direct friend for 4 years and whose concern for Nadia expressed itself in blunt observations delivered with complete honesty, took her to lunch on a Thursday in the 4th month of the marriage, and said what she had been holding for some time. "I am not telling you there is something wrong with him," she said, which meant she was at least considering that there might be. "I am saying he sounds like a man who exists on 2 separate planes and you are only familiar with one of them." Nadia ate her rice and waited. Diane said, "He goes away without explanation. He came from nowhere verifiable. He has a quality about him that you keep coming back to, something that does not match the life he is claiming. All I am saying is, notice it. Let yourself actually notice it rather than filing it." Nadia said, "I have been noticing." Diane said, "And?" Nadia said, "And I am not ready to open that yet." She knew this was true, and she knew it was not the most admirable truth about herself. She was afraid of what opening the file would mean, not because she expected to find something terrible, but because she expected to find something complicated, and she had already made a significant choice on the basis of the simple version of things, and the complicated version would require her to revisit that choice in a way she was not yet ready to do. Her mother called every 10 days, which was regular enough to be rhythm rather than accident. The calls had evolved from the initial one, which had been a masterclass in controlled fury, into something quieter and more strategic. Comfort had moved from open opposition to careful inquiry, the way a general studies terrain after a battle she did not win. She asked about health and work and practical matters. She did not ask about Kweku directly, but her questions had a shape to them, a frame, designed to determine whether Nadia's life was producing the discomfort she deserved without making it obvious that this was what was being measured. Nadia gave facts. She was well. The work was full. She was managing. Nothing editorial. On one call, into a pause that her mother had left open on purpose, Nadia said, "I did not marry him to punish you." Silence. "I know you have been building toward that conclusion," Nadia said. "I can hear it in the questions, but it is not what happened. I married him because talking to him was the first time in years that I felt like an already complete person, not a project, not a situation that needed improving, just a person." Her mother said, "That is a reason to value someone's company, not necessarily a reason to build a life." Nadia said, "Maybe, but it was the reason I had." Comfort was quiet again. Then she said, "Come for dinner when you are ready, not now, when you are ready." Nadia said she would think about it. She carried this conversation with her for the rest of the week. She carried the whole accumulation of things she was not yet looking at directly. She was a person who prided herself on honesty, on looking at things clearly, and she was doing neither of these things with precision, and she knew it, and she was not ready yet. And she was nearly ready. And then on a Wednesday evening she came home from work, and Kweku's coat fell off the hook. The coat was dark blue. It was the coat he wore in the harmattan season, on the evenings when the dry wind came in from the north, and the temperature dropped to something that made a coat reasonable. It was one of the better things he owned, better than the rest, better made fabric, better construction, the kind of coat that had been expensive once and that showed it through the quality of its aging rather than any current newness. It fell off the hook when she came through the door. She set down her bag, turned to hang her own jacket, and the coat was on the floor at her feet. She bent down and picked it up. This is what she told afterward, in the account she made to herself in the long hours that followed, and in the longer account she made to Diane the next day, and in the account she made in the book years later. She picked it up because things on the floor get picked up. There was no intention in it. She was tired from work and her feet hurt from the bus journey, and she wanted tea and the coat was on the floor. As she lifted it to the hook, something fell from the inside pocket. A letter. Heavy paper, folded in precise thirds, the kind of folding that happens when you take a formal document and prepare it to be carried. She bent and picked it up and turned it over, and in the upper right corner, in clean printed typeface, was a name that was not the name she had married. Kweku Asante Darko. She stood very still. Below the name, a title, Director, Asante Darko Trust. She looked at the name. She read it again. She read it a third time, not because she had not understood it on the first reading, but because the mind sometimes requires repetition when it is processing something that reorganizes what it already knows. She sat down on the floor, right there, near the door, coat in her lap, letter in both hands. She unfolded it carefully. It was from a law firm. The language was the precise, dense language that legal correspondence uses when significant money is involved and everyone involved wants the record to be unambiguous. It referenced the Asante Darko Trust, which it described as a charitable investment body registered in 3 jurisdictions. It referenced the quarterly investment review. It referenced a board meeting that had been postponed at the director's personal request. It referenced, in a footnote near the bottom of the second page, the founding endowment of the trust, and attached to this footnote was a sentence about the broader family portfolio of philanthropic infrastructure investments, and she recognized in that sentence, with a physical sensation that started somewhere in her chest and spread outward, the names of buildings she had been inside. The Asante Darko Arts Center on the main road. She walked past it twice a week. Had walked past it twice a week for years. She had attended an exhibition there once with a colleague, and had looked at the name on the building the way you look at the names of places that have always been there, as background, as fixture, as permanent as the street itself. The Asante Darko Memorial Health Center. She had gone there for a routine appointment 2 years ago, before any of this, before the wedding or the market or the back fence. She had sat in the waiting room and read a magazine and registered the name above the door the way you register the names of places as you enter them, automatically and without investment. The library at the university. She had spent 3 years of her undergraduate degree in that library, in the particular quality of its light through tall windows, in the accumulated quiet of its reading rooms, in the smell of books and the low productive hum of people thinking. It had a name above the entrance she had read on the first day she arrived and had not thought about since. All of those names were this name. Her husband's family had built the library where she had learned to think. She sat on the floor and let this settle. It settled slowly and completely, the way cold settles, reaching every part of the room before you are fully aware of how cold you have become. She got up eventually. She put the letter on the small table. She made tea and did not drink it. She stood at the window and watched Mrs. Corte moving through the courtyard below, slow and certain, tending her garden with the unhurried expertise of someone who has been doing this for decades, and has concluded that hurry has nothing to offer gardening. She sat at the table. She stood again. She moved through the small room with the particular restlessness of a person whose thoughts are too active for stillness. She put the letter in the center of the table, where he would see it when he walked in. Then she sat in one chair and she waited. She had 2 hours. She used them to think, really think, not to circle the thought but to enter it. She thought about every observation she had filed. The hands, the substituted words, the man across the street who had stopped and turned away, the ease in certain spaces, the kind of ease you absorb from a lifetime of belonging. She thought about each of these individually and then she thought about them together, and she understood that the file had always been pointing at the same conclusion, and she had always known where it pointed, and she had chosen not to arrive there, because arriving there would require her to hold 2 things simultaneously, the reality that she had been deceived, and the reality that the thing she had felt was real. She was not sure in those 2 hours that she could hold both. She would find out that she could, but she did not know it yet. His footsteps in the courtyard were his footsteps, the specific, unhurried rhythm she knew now the way you know familiar sounds, the way you know the sound of your own house settling at night. She heard him cross the courtyard and climb the steps, and then the door opened. He came through. He saw the letter on the table. He stopped. She watched the shock arrive in him. It was brief, barely a second, barely a flicker, but she was watching and it was there. The body's honest response to being found out. Then his composure returned, but it returned changed, softer and heavier at the same time. The composure of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just understood that the carrying is over. He closed the door. He crossed the room. He sat down in the other chair. He looked at the letter, and then he looked at her, and he did not look away from her face. The silence lasted for what felt like a long time. She let it last. She was not going to fill it for him. She said, "Why?" Just that. One word. He said, "Because I needed to know who I was outside of the name." She waited. He said, "Try to understand what it is to grow up inside something like that. My family's name has been in this city for 3 generations. Every person I have ever met has known it before they met me. Every room I have ever entered has already been arranged around it. Every relationship I have ever had has been filtered through it, and I have spent my entire adult life unable to answer the simplest question: would any of this exist if I had nothing? If the name offered nothing, would people still choose me? Would I be interesting? Would I be capable? I needed to know. I gave myself 6 months to find out." She said, "You were 4 months in when we met." He said, "Yes." She said, "When were you going to tell me?" He said, "I was working toward it. Every day I told myself I would tell you, and every day there was more between me and the words. And every day I did not tell you, it got harder to tell you, because every day there was more to lose." She said, "You let me pay the rent." He said, "Yes." She said, "You watched me plan what we could afford. You watched me put things back." He said, "Yes." She said, "You watched me build a budget around a lie." He said, "Yes." He said yes to all of it. He did not soften it or qualify it or offer her a version that made him easier to understand. He simply confirmed it, all of it, because it had happened, and he respected her enough to confirm things that had happened, rather than manage the telling of them. She stood up. She said, "I need time." He nodded. She put on her shoes and picked up her bag and walked out. The street was still doing what streets do in the early evening, alive with the ordinary traffic of people going home and sellers closing up and the smell of cooking starting in houses as the light dropped. She walked into it and kept walking. She walked for a long time, past the market where they had walked on Saturdays, past the waterfront where they had gone without planning to, past the lorry station near the restaurant with the wobbling chairs. She walked until the streets changed character and then walked back through a different route, and somewhere in the middle of all the walking, her thoughts stopped being a blur of feeling and started being actual thoughts she could hold and examine. She was angry. This was real, and it was right. She had been kept in the dark and she had made choices on incomplete information, and the person who held the missing information had watched her make those choices and said nothing. That was an act of omission that had consequences, real consequences for her daily life, and the anger about it was legitimate, and she was not going to dismiss it. And beneath the anger, or running alongside it, something else. She thought about the market wedding, about the quality of attention he had paid to her from the first conversation, about the way he had listened, about the 2 hours at the back fence and what had been in those 2 hours, which was the unmistakable texture of one person recognizing another person, not performing recognition, not constructing it, simply having it. You could not stage that quality. She knew the difference between someone performing interest and someone who was actually interested. She had been surrounded by performed interest her whole life, the interest of people who were interested in what she represented, rather than who she was, and she had become very good at the difference. What Kwaku had done in those 2 hours at the back fence, and in the market Saturdays and the waterfront afternoon and the wobbling chair restaurant, was see her. Actually see her. The complete version. The real version. Not a curated selection of her better qualities designed to produce a particular impression. That had been real. She was certain of it. She had staked her certainty on it by walking into a registry office in a blue dress, and she had been right to be certain. The deception and the real thing were both true simultaneously. That was what she had to sit with. She went to Diane's apartment and asked if she could stay. Diane said yes and asked no questions. Nadia slept on the sofa under a thin blanket and spent most of the night thinking rather than sleeping. Not circling the thought but entering it, going deeper into it, examining it from the angle where it hurt most, and from the angle where it made the most sense, and from the angle in between. She stayed the second night, the third. On the fourth morning she sat up on the sofa in the early gray light and looked at the ceiling and understood 2 things clearly. The first was that she had not stopped being angry and was not going to stop being angry on a schedule set by anything other than herself. The second was that she had also not stopped knowing that the real thing had been real, and that she was not going to let the anger consume the real thing, because the real thing was what she had actually been looking for when she sat down in a chair by the back fence of a market wedding and stopped pretending she had anywhere better to be. She put on her shoes and went home. Comfort Osai found out on a Thursday morning. She found out through the newspaper, which was the method by which her generation of women found out everything important, slightly too late, and from the wrong angle, which was the nature of information that has traveled through other people before it arrives at you. She had been reading the newspaper with her breakfast for 31 years. It had been her husband's ritual first, a fixed habit of his morning that she had observed and then absorbed after he died, keeping it because it was one of the pieces of him she could keep without explanation. She read it cover to cover, even the sections that did not immediately interest her, because she believed that information you did not seek was often information you needed, and she had been right about this enough times to trust it. The society pages she read last, as a kind of closing survey. She did not care about celebrity, and she did not care about gossip in the ordinary sense, but she cared about who was in which room, and what that meant, and what it might mean for the connections that formed the architecture of her professional and social life. This was not vanity, it was maintenance. The Asante Darko Trust annual foundation dinner appeared in these pages every year. She had seen it reliably, had attended twice in the past decade when her work brought her into alignment with their charitable portfolio, and she knew the name the way she knew all the significant names in the city, as permanent feature, as load-bearing institution, as the kind of organization that does not need to seek attention, because attention has always found it. She turned to the lower right of the page. She saw the director first, recognized the name from the caption. Then she looked, as she always looked at photographs, at everything in the frame. At the edge of the photograph, slightly separate from the formal grouping, uncaptioned, was her daughter. Nadia was wearing a dress Comfort did not recognize. It was not expensive, but it fit her in the way that clothes fit people who have stopped dressing for anyone's assessment, and she stood in the frame with a quality Comfort had not seen on her daughter's face in a long time, the quality of a person who has been through something difficult and has come out the other side still intact, and no longer afraid of the next thing. She was looking at the director. He was looking at her. Comfort set down her coffee cup. She sat for a long time. Then she looked at the director's name again. She thought about the name her daughter had given her the morning after the registry office wedding, the name Nadia had said over the phone with the composure of a woman bracing for exactly the storm that followed. She had looked up that name afterward, which she had not told Nadia, and had found nothing. No professional history, no traceable background, nothing. Because it was not his name. She picked up her phone. Nadia answered on the third ring. Her voice was steady, the voice of someone who had been expecting the call. Comfort said, "I saw the newspaper this morning." Nadia said, "I thought you would." Comfort said, "He is the Asante Darko director." A pause. Then, "Yes." Comfort said, "And you did not know this when you married him." It was phrased as a statement but weighted as a question. She had been deploying that particular construction for decades and she still found it useful. Nadia said, "No, I found out afterward." Comfort was quiet. This was unusual enough for Nadia to notice. Her mother operated in language the way others operated in action. It was her primary instrument, the thing she reached for in every situation because it was the thing she was most capable with. Silence from Comfort Osei was the silence of thoughts being organized, not rested. She said after a long moment, "And is it going to be all right, between you?" Nadia said, "I think so. We are still working through it." Comfort said, "The anger is yours. You do not have to let go of it before you are ready." Nadia said nothing. Comfort said, "He chose you when your name meant nothing to him, when mine meant nothing, when nothing about your situation at the time of the choice gave him any advantage or access. He sat in a room in Ngua with your name on a legal document and nothing else, for months, and he did not leave." A pause. "That is different from what I thought this was." She did not say what she had thought it was. She did not need to. They both knew. She had thought it was a daughter making a reckless choice to wound her mother, attaching herself to a man with nothing, because nothing was the most effective weapon available. She had been right that it was a choice made in the context of their argument, and wrong, fundamentally wrong, about what had made it. Nadia said, "I know." Comfort said, "I am not telling you I was wrong about everything." Nadia said, "I know that too." A long silence, and in it, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to and named, but something in the weather of the call changed temperature. Comfort said, "Come for dinner. Sunday, if you are ready." Nadia said, "Sunday is fine." The dinner was 2 weeks later, not Sunday but close enough, and it was held in the family house that Nadia had grown up in the dining room where the argument had had many of its most structured performances. The table was set the way Comfort always set a table, precisely and without waste. Everything in its correct position, the kind of table setting that communicates effort without communicating sentiment. They ate. Kwaku spoke with Comfort about her work, which was the right choice, because Comfort's work was the subject on which she was most freely herself, and she responded to his questions with the directness she reserved for people she had decided to take seriously, which meant she had decided to take him seriously, which Nadia noted without making a thing of it at the table. At one point, Kwaku said something about a piece of infrastructure development on the northern edge of the city, something technical and precise, that revealed a knowledge of the project's history and funding structure that went beyond casual interest. Comfort looked at him for a moment in the way she looked at things she was revising her assessment of, and then she asked a follow-up question that was genuinely interested, rather than politely pointed, and they talked for 10 minutes about something that had nothing to do with Nadia, and Nadia sat between them and felt something she had not felt in a long time in this house, which was the sensation of things being on a new trajectory. Not healed, not resolved, on a new trajectory. They moved into a house after the second wedding, a real house with more than one room, a kitchen with a window that caught the morning light, a back wall along which there was enough soil to plant something. The curtains were Kwaku's choice, which she had not expected, and they were good. A deep warm yellow that did exactly what curtains should do with morning light, which was to make it something rather than simply admit it. She told him she had not expected him to choose good curtains, and he said he had had a great deal of time in small rooms to develop opinions about what he would do differently when the time came. She laughed, and then she laughed again at the laughing, because she had not laughed that freely in a while, and it felt good and slightly startling, like coming back to a skill you had let lapse. Diane came to dinner in the 6th week of the new house, and sat at the table Nadia had chosen, and ate the food Kwaku had made, and looked back and forth between them, with the expression of a person running a quiet calculation, and arriving at a result she finds satisfying but will not announce. In the kitchen afterward, washing up while Kwaku took a call outside, she said, "Okay, I understand it now." Nadia dried a plate. She said, "Do you?" Diane said, "He looks at you like you are the answer to something he was afraid he would never figure out." Nadia said, "He looked at me like that before I knew who he was, before anyone knew anything. That was the thing I kept coming back to during the 4 days." Diane said, "That is the part worth keeping." Nadia said, "I know." There was a journalist named Carol who came to interview Kwaku about the Trust's new health initiative, an expansion into 3 rural regions that was his own design and had been in development for years. A serious piece of work that had nothing to do with family legacy and everything to do with his own understanding of what he wanted to build. Carol was thorough, and she listened well, and she took notes in a small blue book with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows her job. At the end of the interview, she asked, carefully, whether she could speak with Nadia. Nadia said yes. They spoke for 45 minutes. Carol asked about the story, which she had heard in fragments, the version that had circulated through the social networks of the city before finding its shape. She asked about the registry office wedding. She asked about the room in Namgua. She asked what the 4 days had been. Nadia said, "The 4 days were about me, not about him. I needed to understand why I had made the choice I made, whether the reason was what I thought it was or whether it was something smaller, something reactive. A woman proving a point to her mother. A woman choosing the opposite of what she was told to choose without knowing whether she was choosing it because it was right or because it was opposite." Carol said, "And which was it?" Nadia said, "Both, but not equally. The thing underneath the argument was real, the recognition I felt. I did not manufacture it and he did not manufacture it. We were both, without knowing the other was doing the same thing, trying to find out who we were when nobody was arranging us. He went about it more deliberately and more problematically. I went about it more blindly, and with a lot of collateral damage to my relationship with my mother. But we were both on the same search." Carol wrote this down. Nadia said, "I want you to be honest about the anger in whatever you write. I was angry. It was right to be angry. He kept something from me that I had the right to know, and I had to decide whether the thing underneath the keeping was true. I decided it was. But I did not skip the anger. I want people to know that. You do not have to skip the anger to get to the other side of it." The article ran 2 months later, a sidebar attached to the piece about the health initiative, careful and fair and more accurate than Nadia had expected. She read it at the breakfast table while the yellow curtains did their good work with the morning light. Kwaku came downstairs and looked over her shoulder and read it and said, "She got you right." Nadia said, "She got both of us right." The book was not something she planned. She started writing it the way you start something without knowing it is a start. Sitting down one evening after Diane had suggested, not for the first time, that she write the story down. Not for publication, Diane said. Not for anyone else, just for herself. Just to have the shape of it clear in her own words. Because Diane had a theory, which she had mentioned several times across the years of their friendship, that the best way to know what you actually think about something is to try to write it down and see what arrives. Nadia sat down and started writing, and did not stop for 3 months. What came out was honest, in a way she had not known she was capable of in writing. She wrote about her mother with the clear and complicated regard of a person who has moved beyond the need to make her mother a villain in order to be free of her. She wrote about the argument, all 3 years of it, and what it had been made of, and what she had understood about its ingredients only in retrospect. She wrote about the market wedding, and the back fence, and the registry office, and the room in Nungua. She wrote about the coat and the letter and the 2 hours on the floor and Diane's sofa and the 4 days. She wrote about the anger and the other thing, and how she had learned to carry both. She sent each chapter to Kwaku as she finished it. He read every one. He returned each with the same 2 words. Keep going. She finished in the spring of the following year and sent it to a small press that a friend of a colleague recommended, without expectation, as a kind of record more than a bid for anything. The small press said yes. The small press said they would print 1,200 copies and see what happened. What happened was more than 1,200 copies, which surprised everyone. The book was not a love story. She had been careful about that in the writing and in every conversation about it afterward. It was a story about the cost of being chosen outside of your frame, and the even higher cost of not being chosen for yourself at all. It was a story about the relationship between freedom and knowledge, about what you lose by not knowing a thing, and what you lose by knowing it too late, and what you gain, eventually, from having had to work it out with your own hands rather than having it handed to you already assembled. She dedicated it to Agnes, who had known, at the bus stop, and had acted accordingly. The launch was on a Wednesday evening at a bookshop near the city center. The bookshop owner had arranged the chairs in rows that left a path down the middle and had strung small lights around the shelves in a way that made the whole space warm, without being theatrical. 60 people came. The publisher had told her 50 was a success for a first book, and she had taken this assessment seriously and been quietly and genuinely moved by the number 60. She stood at the front of the room and talked about the book for 20 minutes, the shape of it and what had been inside the writing of it, and then she read 2 sections aloud, which was different from writing them, hearing your own words in a room full of people listening, and she found she was not nervous but was instead very present, very aware of each sentence as it left her. Then questions. People asked good questions. She answered as honestly as she had written. She was answering a question from a woman near the back about the moment of deciding to come back from Diane's apartment, when the door of the bookshop opened and she saw her mother come in. Comfort came in quietly. This was not her usual mode. She was a woman who entered rooms with authority as a matter of habit, not performance, simply the natural comportment of someone who has spent decades moving through spaces as though they belonged to her. She came in quietly tonight, found a chair at the side of the room, sat down, folded her hands in her lap. She met Nadia's eyes across the room for one brief moment, and then looked at the floor, and then looked back up, and was still. Nadia finished answering the question. She finished the session. The room shifted into the loose, conversational phase of the evening. People standing and moving and beginning the process of buying books and asking further questions in smaller exchanges. Comfort made her way to the signing table. She picked up a copy of the book. She turned it over. She read the back with the focused, genuine attention she brought to everything she read, which Nadia had always admired, even when she was not able to say so. She set it down. She picked it up again. She bought 6 copies. She said the cover was good. She said she hoped it would reach the people who needed it. She took the 6 copies under her arm and went back to her chair and sat down, and did not explain the 6. Later, after the room had mostly cleared and the bookshop owner was beginning the gentle work of closing, Nadia came and sat beside her mother in the 2 chairs at the side of the room. They sat for a moment without speaking. Comfort said, "You were right about the dedicated sentence. Agnes deserved it." Nadia said, "She did." Comfort said, "She is the only person in this entire situation who knew exactly what she was doing from the beginning." Nadia said, "Yes, she usually does." A pause. Then Comfort said, carefully, the way she said things she had thought about many times before deciding to say, "I want you to know that I understood, after I finished reading, that I spent a great many years loving you, in a way that was more useful to me than it was to you." Nadia looked at her mother. At the 70-year-old face of a woman who had held the household together by herself for 30 years, through intelligence and determination, and an absolute refusal to be moved by things that were not going to help. At the face of a woman who had expressed her love as management, because management was what she was best at, and because she had never been asked to examine whether best at was the same as right for. She said, "I know, Mama. I have known for a long time." Comfort said, "Then you knew something I did not." This was, in its way, the most significant thing her mother had ever said to her. Not the most dramatic, not the loudest, not the most obviously emotional, but the most significant, because it was a sentence that required Comfort Osei to place herself, for the first time in Nadia's memory, in a position of not knowing relative to her daughter. To acknowledge that Nadia had seen something she had missed. Nadia did not make a ceremony of receiving it. She did not say, "Yes, finally." She did not bring the 3 years of the argument back into the room. She simply said, "I think we have both been learning." Comfort looked at her and nodded once. They sat for another few minutes in the bookshop with the small lights and the smell of books, and the particular quiet of a room that has just held 60 people and returned to itself. Then Kweku came to find Nadia, and he saw the two of them and stopped for a moment in the doorway, and then came over and sat in the chair on Nadia's other side. The three of them sat for a while. Nobody said anything of great importance. Comfort asked Kweku about the health initiative, a specific question about the timeline of the second region, and he answered with the directness he used for real questions as opposed to social ones. She listened carefully. They left together, all three of them, out through the bookshop door into the evening street. Comfort's driver was waiting. She said goodnight to both of them. She said it to Kweku with the same weight she gave it to Nadia, which was a thing Nadia noted and did not say aloud. They watched her get into the car. Kweku said, "6 copies." Nadia said, "6 copies." He said, "Do you think she will give them to people or keep them?" Nadia watched the car pull into the street and merge with the flow of evening traffic. She said, "I think she will give 5 of them to people she thinks need them, and she will keep 1 for herself and never tell anyone which page she turned the corner on." He laughed. She laughed. They walked home through the warm evening, through the neighborhood they had chosen together, and that had been theirs long enough now to have its own familiar texture, its known sounds and smells, and the particular way the light fell at this hour on these streets. In the garden at home, along the back wall, the hibiscus was in full flower, the one she had planted from the cutting Mrs. Corte had left on their doorstep in the Nangua compound, wrapped in damp newspaper with no note. It had survived the move and the repotting in the season, and was now doing exactly what hibiscus does when it has been properly placed, being entirely and specifically itself. She looked at it for a moment before they went in. She thought about the woman who had gone to a market wedding to escape an argument and had sat down beside a stranger at the back fence because she had run out of other places to stand. She thought about all the distance between that moment and this one, and all the things that had happened in the distance, the hard things and the real things and the things she was still understanding. She thought about her mother keeping 1 copy of the book and turning the corner of a particular page. She thought about Agnes, who had known at a bus stop and had acted accordingly, and had never once said "I told you so," which was either the greatest gift of their friendship or the most significant evidence of Agnes's fundamental character, and was probably both. She thought about all of it briefly, and then she stopped thinking about it, because there was the garden, and there was the hibiscus, and there was the evening, and there was Kweku standing beside her, which was, when it came down to it, the complete version of what she had been looking for when she did not quite know she was looking. She went inside. Some things are complete without being said aloud, and some silences, at the end of the right kind of story, are simply where the story rests.